And welcome to today's virtual event where we'll be asking how the EU's new pharma strategy will pave the way for available and affordable medicines. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based here in Brussels, and I'm going to be guiding us through today's virtual conversation. Now, we know that we are meeting virtually here because of the coronavirus crisis, which of course provides the context for today's event. But the issues we're going to be talking about are wider than the current troubles we face, where we're really going to be diving into how the EU can make medicines more available and more affordable. Before we get started, I just want to go over some housekeeping rules with you. You guys at home will be able to ask questions to the panelists using the Q&A feature here on Vimeo. I will be reading out those questions toward the end of each panel. Now, when you ask the questions, make sure that you rename your profile with your name and organization. We won't be taking any anonymous questions, so we need you to make sure that your visible name shows your name and organization, or you can write it in the question. You can also participate in the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #ConsumerDebates. Now, when framing this topic, we have to think long-term. Because over the past years, the challenges of access to medicines in Europe have been increasingly more and more in the spotlight. When new innovative medicines that can help patients come on the market, they aren't always available to everyone due to their cost. In fact, there are significant disparities in access to medicines across Europe. High drug prices threaten to bankrupt some healthcare systems. And at the same time, consumers are exposed to shortages of medicines. This is a long-standing problem that impacts patient care. Indeed, consumer surveys from BEUC members show that shortages can lead to disease worsening, hospitalization, and higher costs for the patient. Now, in November, the Commission published its much-awaited pharmaceutical strategy. This followed the mandate that President von der Leyen gave to Health Commissioner Kyriakides to help ensure Europe has enough affordable medicines to meet its demands. The strategy, of course, comes in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has shed light on the need to enhance the EU's capacity to deal with crisis preparedness and management. For example, by expanding the mandate of the European Medicines Agency so it can help mitigate drug shortages. This is all part of President von der Leyen's call for a, quote, European health union. And she made that call in her State of the Union speech last year. So today's event is an opportunity to hear the views of various stakeholders on the Commission's pharma strategy and discuss the way forward. We're going to have two panels. The first one is going to deal with medicines availability, and the second will deal with medicines affordability. Each panel will be preceded by a short presentation from BEUC member organizations, and they will introduce us to some of the challenges that consumers face in Europe. So let's start with the first of those two presentations. I'd like to turn it over now to Lauriane Lemaine. She's a health expert at UFC Choisir. Lauriane?
Hello, so I'm part of UFC Choisir, a French consumers association, and I'm going to Sorry. Okay. Sorry. I'm going to show you some findings of the study on drug shortages that we conducted in 2020. Next slide, please. The phenomenon of drug shortages is something we are particularly concerned about as it is becoming more and more common, as you can see. For example, in France, we found that the phenomenon was still marginal before 2010, with less than 40 shortages recorded per year. But since 2010, the trend has become completely different and is now exponentially increasing. 400 drugs were out of stock in 2016 and more than 2,000 in 2020. And next slide, please. As part of a study published in November, the UFC Choisir looked at the alternatives that are offered to patients by the drug manufacturers in case they run out of their drugs. So in 37% of cases, drug imports prevent serious consequences for patients. I have listed other alternatives. So other solutions include therapeutic alternatives or extension of shelf life. but in 18% of situations, manufacturers did not propose any solution. Next slide. The therapeutic alternatives are not always satisfactory. Patients may not tolerate them very well and may have allergies. The alternatives may be less suitable and sometimes less effective. Also, delaying or even canceling treatment can have serious medical consequences and increases the risk of death. On this subject, a study by Euroconsumers on the consequences of drug shortages shows that the phenomenon is European. Next slide, please. We also determined which drugs were most affected by the shortages. By studying the profile of drugs declared to be in short supply on the site of the French Drug Agency, we found that the drugs that are out of stock are often old. 75% have a release date prior to the year 2000. These are drugs that are well reimbursed in France, which means that they are evaluated as providing an important medical service. Finally, these are inexpensive drugs. 75% of them are sold at less than 25 euros and 25% at less than 4 euros. Next slide. Regarding the causes of the shortages, we found that not only failures in the supply of active ingredients, but also marketing hacks were highly recurrent. We noted that shortages are concentrated on the least profitable drugs and not on drugs sold at high prices. The economic strategies of the pharmaceutical companies clearly lead them to neglect the security of supply of low-paying drugs. Thus, we particularly denounce the weakening of the production chain linked to the multiplication of the number of intermediaries to lower costs. The just-in-time production is also problematic. Next slide, please. Since the pharmaceutical companies do not sufficiently support this security of supply, we believe that diversification is essential. It is dangerous that certain active ingredients are produced by only one or two producers. This diversification of production may involve relocating to Europe, but only if it means having more producers. We also call for the constitution of sufficient stocks of medicines, which will concern the entire European Union. Finally, a public production of medicines could be considered on a European scale, based on a list of particularly important drugs that are likely to be in shortage. The European Pharmaceutical Strategy is an important step in the fight against drug shortages, as ambitious responses are needed. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lauriane. So now let's move on to the panel where we're going to be talking about some of the issues that Lauriane just outlined in her presentation there. I'd like to introduce our panelists now. We have Ilaria Passarani, she's Secretary General of the Pharmaceutical Group of the EU, PGEU. We have Spanish MEP Nicolas Gonzalez Cesares, member of the European Parliament in the center-left S&D group, and he's also rapporteur for the proposal for a regulation to reinforce the EMA's role in crisis situation. We have Monique Goyens, Director General of BEUC, and Andre Ries, Director of the European Commission's Health Department. Welcome to all of you. Andre, let's start with you, since you know this pharma strategy inside and out. How is the Commission's pharma strategy aiming to address medicines availability?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being invited to this meeting. It's quite important to say that the pharma strategy, the construct of the pharma strategy is based on this important kind of aim or objective, of how to make sure that medicines are available but also affordable. And so I think it's a perfect moment to discuss with you today. But at the same time, we would like to make sure the European industry is able to be innovative, is able to produce, and is able to deliver. So we have to find the right balance between, number of competing often ideas and processes. So we, often we say that COVID crisis, show us in light, many new things, and at the same time, of course, there were already existing. There's not that COVID, this virus, was really, changing everything. The shortages already was said that they really started to accelerate before the crisis. You have seen the French case, when you see the curve, it was really 2017 was like a breaking point. The numbers raised very rapidly. At the same time, global supply chain, the risk was there. We did see this when we introduced the falsified medicines directive, and we started to work with countries like China and India, and see all kinds of difficulties, but also challenges in this supply chain. So this is just COVID. But what is important in the strategy, we also like to address and combine the work of European Commission in the other fields like chemical strategy, Green Deal, digital agenda, cancer plan, which will be announced today, and all this work should be somehow integrated and work together. But coming back to the strategy, so of course this is important to see this from the legislative agenda, because this is what we believe it may help, may change the landscape. But there are a number of actions we propose already, and we really are trying to push a number of developments simultaneously with building the potential changes in the legislative framework. Legislative framework should take into account, of course, continue to make sure the quality and safety of medicines is a principle, but of course, same time as we discussed today, affordability and access. So we also like to have a look, how this may work in the relations to the global supply chain. What are the best measures to get into the balance framework, which allow the access to ingredients from third country, but at the same time make sure that we are building our own capacity in Europe to be more independent and resistant in the especially the time of crisis or shortages on the global level. So regulatory system is under review. We are starting with the important part of legislations, orphan, so medicines for rare disease patients, but also so-called pediatrics medicines, so medicines for children. There are two groups of patients. They are in need of special treatment and often quite unique and often also quite expensive. But at the same time, as we have seen in a number of studies, even medicines is authorized on the EU level. It's not available in a number of countries. So we'd like to continue to see how we can do this better. So then the target for changes of potentially the regulatory agenda is by 2022, but we will submit, the proposal as they will come out of the regulatory pipeline. So end of this year, there will be orphan and pediatrics, and we continue work on the bigger package by end of 2022. And just a few words about the shortages. As already was said, this is relatively new phenomena, but at the same time, it's already was seen in especially the small markets in numbers of years. We have got this signal from Cyprus, from Slovenia, Estonia, big countries like France, Germany, also Belgium, which was relatively having good situation up to 2015, 2016. It's also started to see this more and more, as we again have seen in the French case. So we would like to study this area a little bit much deeper than so far we're able to do. So we committed studies by external contractor last year, and we hope by summer this year we'll get results, and of course we'll share with all of you, and hopefully we'll get a little bit more clear information about the cause of shortages, and then we should look for the remedia and see what's may work better. And finally, you mentioned already our proposal for the reinforcing a mandate of European medicine agencies. This was very strong lessons we learned from COVID, that to really know, how to manage shortages, and especially we have seen the case of ICU medicines for patients in the very critical health situation due to COVID. We have seen, that how more we have to work together across the continent. Again, as was said in the presentation, coordination and communication, and also access to databases, often on the local level, hospital level, national stockpile. All these things have to be combined, and especially crisis is showing this more and more as is important. So we strengthen the mandate of European Medicine Agency to operate in the big crisis like this, but also in the situation when we may see critical medicine shortages due to other type of problems. So mandate is there. We started negotiations. I'm happy to see today a reporter from the European Parliament, and we hope that they'll be able to get to the final with this piece of regulatory framework as soon as possible. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Andre. Good to get an idea of what's coming up with the Commission. Ilaria, let's turn to you next. How are the shortages that Lauriane outlined impacting pharmacists in their everyday practice? And we've just heard Andre outline his expectations for the Pharma Strategy. What are your expectations for the Pharma Strategy?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Dave, let me first say how happy I am to participate in this debate today and to see many former colleagues and friends among the speakers and the participants. Shortages have indeed a significant impact on pharmacy daily practice. The results of the latest survey that we conduct every year among our members indicate that the situation is getting worse and worse in most European countries. Every week, a pharmacist in Europe spends on average 6.3 hours dealing with medicine shortages and finding solutions for patients. And all classes of medicines are affected, both life-saving medicines and very commonly used drugs. As Lauriane well said, shortages cause distress and inconvenience to patients because of the interruption of treatment, but also because of increased co-payments as a result of more expensive or non-reimbursed alternatives. But they also affect the community pharmacy business because of the financial loss due to the time that is invested in mitigating shortages, and also because of reduced patient trust and reduced employee satisfaction. Across Europe, there are strong differences in terms of the legal solutions that community pharmacies can offer in case of a shortage. They include, for example, looking for the same medicine from alternative sources. It can be added pharmacies where it is allowed, or from the manufacturer directly in case of contingency plan. It can be changing the same medicines with a different strength when it is available, so the pharmacists adjust the posology accordingly. It can be therapeutic substitution, generic substitution, or in some cases also preparing a compounded formulation. However, some of these solutions are not easily applicable because there are restrictions such as the need for a new prescription. And this can be burdensome and time consuming for the pharmacist, and also obviously for the patient who has to go back to the physician. However, the truth is that COVID-19 has made the general public aware of the vulnerability of supply chains, both for medicines and medical equipment. We saw that at the beginning of the pandemic outbreak. But it is actually a structural issue that pharmacy has been faced with for over a decade already. And community pharmacies across Europe have been doing everything they could and they can to further prevent the worsening of shortages. And in some countries, I must say, they have also been successfully empowered in this role by their national authorities with an expansion of the role of the pharmacist and the scope of pharmacy practice. But many barriers still remain. With regard to your questions on the pharmaceutical strategy, in relation to the pillar on the availability of medicines that we are discussing in this panel, our expectation and our hope is that all the foreseen initiatives, including the regulation to expand the mandate of the European Medicines Agency, will finally bring meaningful solutions to patients and to healthcare professionals. And we hope that in the coming years, when we conduct our annual survey on shortages among our members, we will be able to provide better results than we currently can. Thank you.
Thanks, Ilaria. Nicolas, let's turn to you next. What do you think are the main lessons from the way the EU has managed the pandemic response? And how can the proposed regulation to expand the EMA's mandate help address them? Obviously, the role of the EMA here has been up for a lot of discussion and controversial. How do you think we could change that role?
Let me switch on the micro. Okay, thank you. First, thanks for having me here, for inviting me. I think we haven't learned all the lessons of the pandemic yet, but of course, we have learned a lot. Today, we know how important it is to have an European health policy, which includes the pharmaceutical industry, of course. We haven't seen how important it is to work closely with industry to find solutions and expedited response in a health crisis such as a pandemic. We are realizing now how important it is to be in control of supply chains. I'm not talking having all the supplies in the EU, but we make mass efforts in that direction. I am also optimistic about one thing. When we focus all efforts on a solution, we get almost a miracle of like a vaccines are. Yes, we are discussing a lot of times these days the role of the EMA agency in this discussion and this sort of crisis of the vaccination in Europe that I think is a very good strategy that we have. But of course, we don't need only a strategy, we must implement that. And we are doing it now, and we are realizing what problematic is to deal with all the issues that we are facing. The proposal to reinforce the EMA, I guess, will help us in crisis such a pandemic like this, or in another type of crisis. I think that not all the crises in the health in Europe will be a pandemic. We can face other kind of crisis, and we should be prepared. So we have to propose, and we will propose in this legislative piece, solutions on how to tackle the shortage of medicines in Europe too, because emergencies and crises are one thing, an acute problem, and shortages were chronic in Europe before the coronavirus. So, for example, we had previous resolutions in this parliament about how to address medicine shortage. So we had two different parts on this piece of regulation of the reinforcement of the role of the EMA. In one hand, we have how to address crisis, and the other hand, how to address the chronic shortage that we had from a long time ago. So I see two different, and I see different ways to solve that. We are proposing that in this regulation. Thank you.
Monique, let's go to you. From a consumer's perspective, what do you think is the most pro-consumer response to the problem of drug shortages at EU level?
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. Before responding to your question, Dave, I would really like to confirm what has already been said by the previous speaker. This is not a theoretical discussion. And this is not just about rare diseases. And this is not just about COVID vaccines. There is a general problem of drug shortages. And Lauriane presented the results of the French survey by USA Cusloisir, but this is also supported by surveys carried out by other BEUC members in Italy, by Altro Consumo, in Belgium, by Testachat, in Spain, by OCU, in Portugal, by DECO. Those surveys demonstrated that 45% of the surveyed households have experienced drug shortages over the last 2 years. There are a lot of interesting figures in those studies, but just to say that this is not just a reason for stress or for frustration, it leads to very important consequences. For example, in Belgium, on 5% of the reported cases, this led to a hospitalization. So this is a serious problem and it needs to be tackled. And of course, COVID and the whole discussion since the last weeks about availability of the vaccines, I mean, this is of course a serious problem that needs to be tackled, but it has also shed the light on a more global problem, which is the vulnerability of our supply chains and our high dependency on third country or a limited number of companies and third country manufacturers. So there is a need for a response, and there is a need for a European response. And can I say, we welcome the Pharma Strategy. We really believe it's not only timely, but it also goes into the right direction. And in particular, we support, and that's now the answer to your question, Dave, at last, we particularly support the proposal to tackle the structural problems of our supply chains. And I would like to make three comments on that. First of all, what we see is too often a conversation between the policymakers and the pharma industry. But when you want to speak about the availability of drugs, you also need to center on the patients and on the consumers. They need to be, and maybe also the pharmacists, but Ilaria made her case very well. But so you need to include the demand side in that conversation. It's not a bilateral, it must be a multilateral discussion. Second, you need to focus on prevention, meaning prevent the shortages rather than addressing them. And that means transparency, and especially transparency by the industry on the root causes. Why is there a shortage? So that you can prevent it at a later stage. And third point I wanted to make, there is really the need to open up to alternative approaches to medicine production. For example, in an emergency, why not make it possible for non-profit pharma undertakings to take over or to complement and to be combined with let's say the leading pharma company? There needs to be really let's say flexibility when it comes to who is able to provide, or even the pharmacists, like the individual pharmacists could also help providing solutions. But we need to open up to, can I say, the monopoly of medicines production by those who have the patent. Thank you.
Monique, you mentioned supply chain vulnerability, and that brings me to a question about this idea of strategic autonomy. This is a big umbrella term that's the big buzzword in Brussels right now, extending into all kinds of areas of policy, but it has been mentioned in the Pharma Strategy, specifically when it comes to reshoring the manufacturing of medicines to the EU. So let me ask this to Nicolas. What do you think of this idea of reshoring the production of medicines in Europe in order to guarantee supply? And also, I will ask you what you think of the new mechanism put in place on Saturday, restricting export of supply that's made here in the EU in order to guarantee supply in the EU. What do you think of those two ideas, reshoring and export restrictions?
Okay. Let me go first for the second question about the mechanism to it's not a mechanism to restrict the exports. First, this is the first thing that we have to know. It's a mechanism to know how the vaccines are exported from Europe to third countries, because we have to control all the sports in order to control also, in this case, to the AstraZeneca industries, because we have a problem with the supply of the vaccines to Europe because the contracts. Okay, I strongly believe with Monique audience previously when he was talking about the transparency. And of course, we need transparency. And in this case, we didn't have enough transparency on the contracts. And this is one of the main reasons of this crisis again about the sports. And let me go for the first question now. I think that we must keep strong parts of the supply chain in Europe. I know that it's impossible to have all the supply chain here. It's absolutely impossible now. But we have to put our efforts in get a good industry in Europe that can manage all the supply. It's not only having the supply here, it's of course having the tools to put pressure in the industry to manage the shortage in a short time, because we are addressing a lot of shortage that it will be very easy to solve, but we don't have the tools. And I think that we are building a tool with this regulation of the EMA. Thank you.
Monique, I'm curious to get your perspective on this. From a consumer's perspective, what do you think of these two ideas, reshoring and potential export restrictions?
Well, on the reshoring, what I would like to say is, yes, indeed, we need to diversify the supply chain. That is for sure. In order to, because for the moment we are relying on two, first of all, there is a high concentration of the industry and also of the manufacturing of active ingredients in third countries. However, what I would like to say is that from the consumer perspective, you also need to look at the affordability element. And if you have all the production concentrated in Europe, you might also have a problem of increase in prices. So we need a little bit to balance that, but let's say we are totally in favor of diversification, including, of course, in also partly the domestic production, domestic meaning EU. When it comes to export bans, we don't like the word bans, and we believe that everybody in the world has the right to be vaccinated. What we believe is, again, a little bit, there has been a lot of public money put into this vaccine. So it's a public good. And to some extent, there is an expectation by the people, by public opinion, that those vaccines are also available for the European population. So it is very, very important there that there is a need for transparency, to have that public trust and to have public acceptance of also exporting. So the contracts have not been transparent. Now they are, under pressure, being released with high levels of reduction. So I really believe that if you want to contribute to public acceptance of, let's say, a worldwide dissemination of the vaccines, you need to make those transparent, and also you need, again, I repeat myself, to address the root causes. There should be transparency by the companies about why there has been a shortage. Is it a shortage because there is a problem at the supply chain, at the factory, or is it a shortage because they have decided at the end of the day to supply somebody else? It's quite a different conversation.
Ilaria, from the pharmacist perspective, what's your take on these two ideas?
So on the first point, PGU support the proposed measure to reduce the dependence on third country for the manufacturing of certain vulnerable and critical medicines and chemicals, as outlined in the Pharmaceutical Strategy. However, bringing production back in Europe is not, in my point of view, the magic solution. And there are many challenges and risks for continuous supply that should be taken into account. The first one, Monique already mentioned, is the price increase for some medicines, which can be acceptable only if this is proportionate to the provided guarantees for the security of supply. But also we should take into account the compliance with the EU environmental laws. And so we need to monitor the impact of on the environment of an increased production of chemicals and medicines back in Europe. So that is also an element that should be considered when weighing the challenges and the opportunities. At the same time, I think it's important to maintain a relationship with those countries producing this chemical today to prevent export restrictions or protectionist measures as we experienced at the beginning of the outbreak. And this also responds a little bit to your second question. It worked both ways. The supply chains are global, they are highly integrated, And you cannot criticize protectionist measure when they negatively affect you, and then implement them when it serves your interests. But I think that more generally, I think that to resolve the existing vulnerabilities of the supply chain, we should develop further, as has been said already, a diversification of supply more. And this can take the form of, for example, of setting requirements for manufacturers to rely on more than one active pharmaceutical ingredient or excipient provider.
Andre, Monique mentioned the need to shed more light on supply chains and the need for more transparency. I know that the Commission has often said they would like to have more transparency, for instance, with the vaccine issue. They'd like to be able to publish the contracts, but confidentiality clauses mean they can't. We also seem to know that not as much is known about exports as we might have thought, we've learned in the last week. So what can the Commission do to have more transparency in supply chains in the short term with the tools available now, and what new tools could the EU have in the future to make the supply chain more transparent?
I think there are two elements I would like to pick up from the previous speakers. One is the contracts were signed, also with the kind of prepayments, done by EU, helping industry to develop the capacity to produce, and we are discussing also about the capacity of production. And then, of course, the contracts are contracts, so we understand, and as a party that the delivery will be as proposed by the parties. So then things change, and this is why we brought this new instrument, which we are now using. So transparency is much better now. I think we know more and more about the plans of export. So far, as was said, we didn't ban or put any restriction of exports. The countries are getting vaccines produced in Europe. But of course, it's important that we see the situation at the same time. Consumers, in this case, citizens, because they're not patients, are getting access to those medicines because, and I think we in our strategy, we always said we like to supply, building capacity in Europe. This means also that we will supply the global world. We should not forget that Europe is still the biggest vaccine producers, but also many of those vaccines, they were developed in Europe, thanks to research money, support of European Investment Bank, but also, the contracts we're able to sign. So I think it's of course, important that we also kind of participate in the global goods circulations and involvement of the EU in the COVAX mechanism. Also, is a mechanism to bring money together, allowing the countries with the lower income countries to get into the vaccines. It's also an important instrument. So of course, the resources, money are also an important factor in this in the story. But I think it's very interesting lessons. How parties can come together, speaking with industry, to increase the capacity in situation like this one, because we can. Okay, we are still in the momentum that few companies, quite important companies, decided to join the effort of the production together with the, normally on the market competitors, but they decided to join. We'll see hopefully results, in next months. But this is also interesting, development during COVID. We didn't see this, often in the past, so let's hope it will give us, one more lesson, for the future. And the last point on the third countries, we have to, like I said, that we will not bring every production to Europe we need. It's not possible. I mean, it's today there are a number of problems with the production, not just produced in Europe and in good price. Environmental is a very important factor. For example, a very interesting discussion with industry about the greening production in pharma sector. We just had a recent discussion about antibiotics, how you can then produce better, but at the same time, how we can work with the third countries to help them with the greening production, this was a very interesting case from India, when Swedish agency is helping the Indian producers to be more green. And at the same time, we are working with the Chinese and Indian authority to make sure the inspection power or ability to inspect the production capacity in India or in China is increased. And we are collaborating also to make sure the supply chain is not just cheaper, if this is the case, but is also high quality. Because I think this is what finally patients and consumer wants. It's not just any medicine, but also medicines which are just in good quality medicine.
Well, let's take a question from the audience. We have a question from Iliane Izvernicianu. So she asks, do the speakers think there is enough level of competition in the pharma industry? Let me put that question to Monique. I know you guys are often concerned about competition problems. Do you think there's enough competition in pharma, and is that affecting vaccine availability?
Well, can I say the pharma industry has very often a monopoly over a medicine, so you have really a problem of monopolistic situations. Now, being dominant in the market is not per se an infringement of competition law, but abusing of this monopoly by, for example, withdrawing a medicine from the market and then reintroducing it, sometimes with another name, but at a much higher price, that might be abusive, and it has happened also in the past. So we believe that indeed there is a huge competition angle in the whole, let's say, tackling of drug shortages. Because if that is, there are what we call economic withdrawals in order to create an artificial shortage of a drug, and then you reintroduce with higher prices. So I would say that competition authorities, both at national and at European level, can certainly contribute to putting more pressure on the companies by creating a more competitive approach to drugs on the market, and certainly also on their prices, but that's another conversation.
Nicolas, let me put that question to you as well. Do you think there's enough competition in the pharma industry?
Okay, I really do think that we have competition, but I really don't know if it is enough, because this is a singular market. For example, the pharmaceutical industry has a peculiarity. The end customer, the patient, does not have the ability to choose which brand or laboratory they buy their medicines from. When you buy omeprazole from a pharmacy, or are giving amoxicillin in a hospital, you don't even know who gets your money. So this is an important reason for a powerful regulator that protects consumers, not only pricing and affordability, which is very important, also safety first. So we must introduce more competition, but keeping in mind always that safety is the most important thing in this market. Because yes, we consumers, patients, we don't know who is the company in our lab, in our omeprazole or paracetamol. So we must be protected by a strong regulation, and this is the way we have to follow in future.
So we're just about out of time for this panel, but I want to do one more very quick question to Andre. This question comes from Charlotte Raffayan from France Associante. She asks, could safety stocks of medicines be part of the new supply obligations mentioned in the Pharma Strategy? Andre, do you have a quick answer to that?
Yeah, this is one of the idea. I know how we make sure that we have stocks available. This is why also we, as you know, we announced the work on the HERA, the new instrument EU would like to have. This is authority in the crisis management, and hopefully, working together with the member states, we may find a better way of managing the strategic stockpiles. Because of course, we also learned through this crisis that if you start to use national stockpiles, you may also affect the EU market. So we need to find solution. I think in the presentation for today's panel, we have seen this. We have to look for European solution, because just having own stockpile in your hospital, in your region, in your country is not enough, because you can easily great situation. Now we see, for example, situation in Portugal under the siege of COVID, and they need more ICU medicines because simply they have many more patients they were told they will have. So we need to move this blanket, fire blanket to Portugal and help Portugal.
Well, let's move on to the issue of medicines affordability. Let's move on to the next panel. Thank you to all of the panelists for the availability topic. So now let's move on to our next presentation. That's going to come from Martien van Hek. She's a health expert at Testachat here in Belgium. Martien?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Prices of medicines are raising concern for consumers thank you. So prices of, next slide, please. Prices of medicines are raising concern for consumers as expenditure on medicines is increasing steadily. In Belgium, public health insurance spent in 2019 4.7 billion euros on the reimbursement of medicines. And this is 700 million euros more than in 2014. Next slide, please. This rising cost is mainly concentrated in domains where companies can charge excessive prices and expect high profitability. For orphan medicines, for instance, expenditure of our public health insurance tripled over a period of 10 years' time. And this due to a combination of more medicines being developed on one hand, and because of rising prices on the other hand. Next slide, please. And on this slide, you can see some examples of medicines recently marketed, and they have two things in common: important public funding for their development on one hand, and excessive prices on the other hand that cannot be justified on reasonable grounds. Next slide, please. And while as such, this increasing development of orphan medicines is good news for some patients, many other patients are left to their own devices because no medicines are being developed for their disease. And in view of the excessive prices companies charge for their medicines, reimbursement and access to these medicines might be compromised. Even in a rich country as Belgium, for some medicines, reimbursement has been limited to some categories of patients, while more patients could have benefited from it. And there is also an important indirect impact of those increasing prices. Spending for medicines is excessive compared to public money we invest in other important domains as dental care, for instance, or psychological care. And this is leading to big access problems there. And so at the longer term, it's our public health insurance system that's at stake. And that's why actions are urgently needed to reverse this evolution and to guarantee access to affordable medicines for every patient who need it. And we see there an important role for the European Commission, as member states alone cannot fix the problem. Next slide, please. So in the first place, governments need more transparency to be able to negotiate fair prices. On R&D cost of medicines, for instance, as this is often the main argument companies use to justify their high prices. And we welcome the Commission's initiative to develop guidelines for establishing R&D cost of medicines, but the EU needs to go a step further and make disclosure of R&D costs mandatory for companies. We also need more transparency about prices member states pay for medicines, and the secrecy authorities accept now of price discounts offered by pharmaceutical companies should be replaced by exchanging information of real prices member states pay, and ultimately by complete transparency. And in the second place, the EU should facilitate that member states join forces to negotiate prices and to procure medicines together, as this way we can have more weight in the discussions with pharmaceutical companies. And there is some experience we can build on, like the recent joint procurement of COVID-19 vaccines by the Commission. And then finally, public funding and alternative R&D models play an important role in addressing unmet medical needs. And the EU should play, according to us, a leading role in the selection and the implementation of these alternative R&D models. And while we fully support public investment for R&D, we ask for putting in place conditions to guarantee society can benefit at large from the investments it's paid for. So according to us, the Pharma Strategy brings an opportunity to implement these action points. Thank you.
Thanks, Martine. So some very interesting information about drug prices there. So now let's move on from the availability issue and to the affordability issue, because sometimes medicines are there. The supply isn't the problem. The problem is normal people can't afford them. Let's talk about what the Pharma Strategy can do about that. I'd like to introduce our affordability panel now. We have with us Adrian van der Hoven, Director General of Medicines for Europe, Luisa Crisigiovanni, Secretary General of the Italian consumer organization Ultraconsumo, Claudia Furtado, Head of the Health Technology Assessment Department in Portugal, which currently holds the EU's rotating presidency. And we still have Andre from the European Commission, Director of the Commission's Health Department. So, Adrian, let's start with you. The Pharma Strategy announces a review of the pharma legislation to improve access to generics and biosimilars. What concrete measures would Medicines for Europe like to see in place to increase market competition? You're on mute. Great.
Thank you very much. Apologies for that. So thank you very much. Yeah, I think the Pharma Strategy contains a number of proposals which will be worked on in the future to encourage more competition at expiry of patents or other protections in the pharmaceutical sector. And this is critical not just for affordability, but also for access, because every country in Europe, the poor Eastern European countries, the small countries, but also big Western European countries, they do apply restrictions on prescribers for expensive medicines. So when you enable competition to drive affordability, you actually increase the number of patients who can be treated with those medicines. What we can see concretely is that there is suboptimal use of generic and biosimilar medicines in many different countries. This is due to two factors. And they're cited in the Pharma Strategy as things the Commission will help the member states with. So one can be that there are barriers to competition at expiry. So some of this has to do with misuse of intellectual property to do something called evergreening, where you artificially extend, if you wish, monopolies beyond what the law has foreseen. And there are very concrete proposals in the pharmaceutical strategy, such as the Bolar exemption, so harmonizing that enables the generic industry or the biosimilar industry to basically develop and bring a medicine to the market on the first day of expiry. So the Commission wants to make sure that works and functions effectively. A second area that the Commission is looking at is in procurement. So there's a lot of games played in procurement around the time of the expiry of the patents. So what happens is, let's say a few months before the generic or the biosimilar enters the market, somehow a procurement contract is agreed. And this is extended beyond the date of expiry, so that basically the procurement contract goes beyond the date when the first generic or first biosimilar can enter the market. And this extends, artificially the monopoly period. Some countries have dealt with this by introducing laws requiring the reopening of procurement contracts when a first generic or a first biosimilar enters the market. And these are some ideas that could be explored going forward. So I think There's a lot there about encouraging competition. The Commission is also looking at procurement in general and reimbursement in general, because contrary to popular belief, the European Union actually regulates this because it's an internal market issue. And there they're looking at both increasing, stimulating competition, but also at security of supply, that shortage issue that you were mentioning about introducing security of supply criteria into purchasing, essentially. Not easy, but it's definitely doable. It will take some time. And a final thing, and I think this is more for the national level, in almost every country today in Europe now, there are kind of pharmaceutical contracts between the pharmaceutical industry and national governments to try and balance the budgets. Historically, my industry has been excluded from those contracts. We've never been invited to participate in them, but increasingly we are partners. So for example, in Belgium, in Italy, in Spain, all kinds of countries, now our industry is invited. Why? Because in part of these contracts, we can bring more competition, create, let's say, more flexibility in the budget for the governments to invest more in all kinds of things, new drugs, more nurses, all kinds of activities. I think that's a positive change, and it should be encouraged going forward that we get a seat at the table of these pharmaceutical contracts. Thank you.
That's quite an interesting point on the last one there. Let's turn to Luisa next. Luisa, Ultraconsumo played a key role in an Italian antitrust authority investigation into the pharma company Aspen, which was accused of having big price increases on some cancer drugs. And the Commission is now about to close its own investigation into that. Could you see a way that that investigation could result in a significant price reduction across Europe? And do you see the role of consumer groups in triggering investigations on this type of excessive pricing as being instrumental here? Can they cooperate with the antitrust agencies?
Yes, thanks, David, for the question. Actually, I think the opportunity for consumer organization is there to play their actual role as a watchdog of the market, as has been explained, gathering data from consumer complaints and monitoring the market prices, do research, and then they feed the authorities' investigation to that respect. And that was the story behind our denounce of abuse of dominant position in Aspen cases, but also in Roche-Novartis case, in Spinraza case, and some of them were, as you said, success stories. In the case of Aspen, why is so important? Actually, we denounce this infringement of dominant position, which determines excessive prices, which has a consequences the shortages of benzene. So in the end, people cannot afford and do not have their treatment. Second, the issue is relevant because it constitutes a real important precedent for determining what constitutes excessive prices and what is excessive profit also in the market of no patent drug, because in the case of Aspen, anti-cancer drugs, we were talking about no patent drug. In the case of Roche-Novartis, Avastin Lucentis case, we were talking of patented drugs. In the case, again, of Lidient, we were investigating orphan drugs. So it's a complex market for sure, but the role we can play is to bring in evidences and really to team up with the competent authorities, both on national level and at European level. And it's not by, let's say, by chance that in the end, after the wins that we had at all level of judgment at national level, the Commission actually proposed some commitment to Aspen, and we will see how we will come up. But the commitments of Aspen actually are talking about price reduction on average by 70%. So there is a huge price increase that we are talking about, affecting at least 6 anti-cancer medicine. So it's a quite important issue, let's say the price setting. Then, of course, bearing in mind what has been said by European Commission before and even big pharma industry, we need to balance for sure research and development cost, let's say with this element of accessibility. But then it comes the other role that we want to play, and I hope we will be at the center of the new pharma strategy, the issue of transparency of the investment in research and development, not only related to the contribution and the grant received by the public money, by the state, but as a whole. So we need transparency on the budget. That can be, let's say, a good track that has been already tackled also by the World Organization, Health World Organization resolution of 2019. So we encourage this to be part at the center of the pharma strategy, the new, pharmaceutical strategy European Commission, as well as much more collaboration among competent authorities and health authorities and consumer group to really have a multi-stakeholder answer to the difficult question of the supply chain. So behind, let's say, the shortages of medicine, there is a complex story, but since 2014 at least, consumer groups, consumer organizations such as Altro Consumo, many other colleagues around Europe really back the competent authorities with all our knowledge and gathering consumer complaints to feed at our best the discussion with evidence, facts, and figures, but also going to court. Because if we are not paying drugs as consumer, for sure we pay them as taxpayer, and the worst case we pay with life. So I really hope the pharma strategy to take this into consideration, as Monique mentioned before. Thank you.
Claudia, let's turn to you next. Portugal took over the rotating presidency of the Council of the EU just at the beginning of last month, and a number of pharmaceutical issues have fallen into the presidency's lap. So what are the presidency's plans for Council conclusions on pharmaceuticals, particularly when it comes to affordability? And do you think we can get a Council agreement on the HTA regulation under this presidency, which of course will end in July?
Good morning, everyone. Yes, these are our main goals about the Council conclusions and to conclude the HTA regulation. In particular, with the first topic, the Council conclusions, we aim to address affordability as well as accessibility and availability in 3 conferences that we are organizing with the NCAP, the competent authorities for pricing and reimbursement, the directors of pharma policy, and the one conference that we are organizing that is that will have a broader spectrum. That is 3 A's: accessibility, affordability, and availability. In these initiatives, and in particular with the theme of affordability, we will address issues that are aligned with the pharmaceutical strategy and with the concerns of the most of member states that are the need for more transparency and clarity in R&D costs. That was already mentioned. More information sharing on net prices that the presentation also identified as an important issue, but particularly as this area is responsibility of each member state, but we think that an exchange of information regarding the ways that each member state address the problem of high cost drugs and the increasing expenditure that we are all having with medicines, in particularly hospital medicines. We think that this the sharing of information about efficient ways to deal with high costs and also to promote generic and biosimilars will promote access and keep the health systems sustainable, at least as sustainable as they can be. And so this is an important focus of our presidency, the exchange of information between member states regarding these topics. We hope with these discussions that result from these 3 conferences, but also the discussions that are being promoted by the European Commission and other entities that we participate, like the HMA and other forums that deal with medicines, but also with discussions that are made by our other stakeholders, like this conference. We think that the discussions that are emerging from all these conferences will help us to produce the council conclusions by the end of our presidency. In relation with the other question that you asked about HTA regulation, we think that it will be an efficient instrument for gaining this efficiency, and so we are very keen to conclude this in the Portuguese presidency. We are making all the efforts to reach an agreement. We are receiving positive contributes from the member states. We are intensively working on it in these weeks. In January was a very intense month to discuss this HTA regulation, and we hope we can reach an agreement between member states and conclude this dossier that we think will improve efficiency and access to medicines in the European context. Thank you.
Finally, Andre, we've already heard from you about medicines availability. Tell us how the Pharma Strategy is aiming to address medicines affordability.
Thank you very much. I think Adrian already introduced the important points concerning the transparency of pricing and uptake of generic and biosimilars. I think it's very important that those medicines, they can be much more affordable to the consumers and patients are on the market. So this is one of the important aim of our work. We also plan to revise the pharma regulations to address the potential aspects of that impact the competitive functioning of the markets, taking into account the impact on affordability. I think this is as I mentioned already in the previous panel, important driver of this whole exercise. The other example will be the something already discussed in this panel, the transparency of the public investment for R&D costs. So for example, in the Inception Impact Assessment we published end of last year for the orphan medicines, we are kind of proposing to instrument which basically the need for the burden proof for the company to show the momentum of prolongations of the exclusivity on the market. We'll continue to work with member states on the already mentioned by Claudia. There are a number of issues, like for example, database which is called Eurodebit is developed since a number of years, and it's important that the database with the prices is getting really better and better and really reflect the real prices on the market. This is what we hope we'll get, continue work with member states. The other area of development is linked to the mutual learning between different authorities across member states, pricing authority, public procurement authorities, or those they dealing with the HTA assessment. We have long-standing cooperation between the HTA agencies, not only proposal, which is still under discussion in the Council and Parliament, but there's also cooperation, across continent between the HTA bodies. So we continue to work with member states, continue to work not just member states but also different agencies, HTA, pricing reimbursement authorities, try to also bridge different aspects of medicines approval, but also same time pricing and HTA. So this work we continue. We would like also to make sure that there is a communication across the different parties. So we hope to continue our interaction with stakeholders. The main focus is the pharma committee. It's the place we have debate between different between member states in the different working groups, for example, on environment, on shortages, on other areas. But they also would like to open the health policy forum platform to have debates with a wider area, wider group of stakeholders, including, of course, BEUC and the national agency. I think this digital tool is helping us to reach, many parties during this next 2 years. So I will conclude, because I think is a critical that the pharma strategy is a kind of the map, our work program for next 2 years, but at the same time, it's we are open for ideas, open for the more information, open for more studies, because finally, what we will develop, it will be hopefully, for the next decade, and we need really also to look forward and find the best possible solution for European system, but mainly for European patients and consumers.
Thanks. Adrian, I have another question for you. When we're talking about drug pricing, always the subject of R&D comes up. Obviously, a lot of effort goes into developing these drugs. That effort takes a lot of money, and that money has to come from somewhere. The Pharma Strategy proposes a revision of the EU legislation on incentives, which is supposed to consider the need to both support that innovation, but also ensure access. How do you think that balance between guaranteeing access and also encouraging innovation can best be struck?
So it's not an easy one, that's for sure. I think there will be a lot of important discussions. I mentioned already there will be some discussions around the Bolar, also around one of the incentives called the SPC that will also be up for discussion. But I think a lot of the focus here is on the incentives, for example, for orphan and for pediatric drugs going forward. Certainly, I think here there's going to be a big discussion about this, and how some modest adjustments to the orphan regulation system will be introduced. I think this is very, very likely around a certain number of areas to try and find a balance here between the need to obviously develop orphan treatments and a balance of affordability across the whole of the EU, because we know, I mean, it's a fact that not all of the EU countries can actually afford some of these drugs, so they're not sold in all EU countries. That's a reality. So that's going to be a difficult issue to solve. I let the other side of the industry maybe give their viewpoint on that. What I can say, though, is how our industry could help, and this is covered in part by the strategy, in part not by the strategy. So certainly one of the things is about stimulating competition at expiry, including for rarer drugs, so for drugs for small patient populations like orphan drugs. And here, I think we do have a problem, because, for example, if you want to develop a generic for an orphan drug or a biosimilar for an orphan drug, it's actually quite difficult to do because, for instance, for a biosimilar, you need to do a set of clinical requirements, meaning basically clinical trials. And practically, that's near impossible to do. So how do we bring competition to orphan drugs at expiry when we cannot organize those clinical trials because we cannot get any patients and we cannot get any of the originator substance? So I think this is something to reflect upon about how to bring competition at expiry, because the current regulatory system doesn't enable it, nor does the market system, because this is, these are very specialized markets in the hand of the incumbent, essentially. So these barriers are definitely there, but I think it's something that needs to be discussed as well. I think there's another issue. There's obviously a problem with a lack of pediatric formulations, including in off-patents, let's say generic pediatric formulations. And here, strangely enough, there's actually a big incentive, a 10-year exclusivity which would be like a 10-year monopoly if you wish, is actually available under European law, but it is not used. I think there have been 2, maybe 3 times this have been used, and these have been commercial failures, if you wish. So there is really a failure of incentives for development of, say, pediatric formulations off patent. That's something we're working on, and we will make a proposal very soon on how something could be done to encourage this kind of development going forward. Just coming back, I think this orphan issue goes beyond orphan, because if you look at, for instance, cancer developments, new cancer drug developments, these are typically multi-indication but very small patient population indication drugs. And I think we will face similar regulatory development barriers for, let's say, biosimilars to some of these products going forward. And we need to think about how do you stimulate that competition. Just also related to what Luisa was saying about the case she has been involved in, I think the competition law issue is more or less settled because there's almost a precedent-setting decision that is out there, and I think companies will probably follow that. What's missing, however, is how do you stimulate generic competition where you have an old off-patent with no generic competition? I think this is something they're doing in the US with a kind of push from the Food and Drug Administration. Maybe that's something we could adapt to the European system as well, so that where you have an old off patent in a kind of monopoly situation, which is weird, you could encourage generic competition to that. It's just a thought that could be an additional point to that competition law issue raised by Luisa.
Well, Luisa, let's get your response to that. First, on this issue of how you strike the balance between availability and making sure that innovation happens. And second, on that issue of how competition policy intersects here.
Yes, how to strike the balance? Well, for sure, we welcome the European Commission intention to revise certain regulation like the orphan drugs regulation and mainly revising the extension period for the patent and the market exclusivity, which was mentioned by Adrian. And second, of course, we support the idea that we've been experiencing right now with COVID vaccines. So joint procurement, negotiation, I think could also bring advantages not only to consumers, but also to big pharma. But the issue is how so they can plan in a way in advance their offer, and they can plan investment within research. So the issue is really how to balance all this, taking into consideration maybe the deal about price negotiation could be sensitive. But where I do see some room is where we can play a role is the contract terms. So we've been experiencing right now shortages in delivering. And why? Because maybe the terms of the contract were not really, openly, probably published and therefore not known. And so they was just kind of way out of exit for big pharma to then play the role offering maybe the stock to someone else. So I don't know, this maybe is the kind of elephant in the room, but the issue is to combine the let's say, so-called contract terms of the delivery. So in a way, the database mapping, when you have a contract and then you can really plan your investment, you should then have a profit and the consumer will have and receive the treatment. But if there are some terms which are unfair, or even worse, they are infringement, and there is an infringement either of the law or the terms, then there should be some consequences. So we are not in favor of sanction as such. As I said, the balance should be also a good contract and a kind of common contract where we have, represented the interest of the investor, of the industry side, the delivery side, the institutions, and of course consumers, who should the one who receive the treatment in the hand. It's a last chain, but at the same time, as I repeated before, is also the one who, in a way, support the research and development. So we don't need to forget this. And all in all, so the budget transparency from one side, but also the contract deal is as important as the price, in my opinion.
Well, you mentioned transparency there, particularly in the relation of transparency in contracts, but there are a number of tools available globally for more transparency in pricing. There's the WHO Transparency Resolution and Fair Pricing Process. And last week, Bayuk published a paper calling for transparency in medicine pricing. We've also heard that from Testachat here in Belgium. Claudia, let me ask you, how can the pharma strategy build bridges with those WTO tools and set kind of a global framework on transparency in pricing? How does the EU's work on this intersect with global efforts?
I think we have all the same aiming, that is increase that transparency. I think the first objective is raise awareness of that issue, and I think it has been done with WHO transparency and also the initiatives included in the Pharmaceutical strategy. So now we have to go to the next step, and I think the synergies between European Union and a more global entity like the WHO are essential to assure that these initiatives can be implemented, because if it's not a global effort, if it's not a cooperation between member states and other countries to, I don't want to say to turn it mandatory, but to require that these costs are presented, the clarity of the costs that are associated with the process of R&D. I think that that has to be done, and we have to work together. And I think the synergies are already there, because there is a partnership between these entities and these initiatives, and we all communicate between ourselves in order to promote this transparency. And I think it is essential. It's going to be probably a long process. It's not immediate. We are not going to have transparency in costs tomorrow, but we want to have it, and we think that if we work together, we will achieve it. And these entities can also develop some tools that can promote these transparency in R&D costs and prices. Thank you.
Adrian, I wanted to get your take on joint procurement. This is obviously an enormously controversial subject in Europe at the moment when it comes to the coronavirus vaccines. But in general, I know it's early days on this, and we have yet to see, how effective this whole strategy will be. But do you think that the joint purchases of COVID-19 vaccines will pave the way for greater cooperation on joint price negotiations and procurement at EU level for all kinds of medicines in the future? Do you think it's helped arguments that should be done in the future more generally, or do you think it's actually hurt arguments for that?
This is a difficult issue. So actually, joint procurement has been used under different formulas for COVID in two instances. So one has been for the vaccine contracts, which are so-called advanced purchasing agreements. And then it has been used as well, it's less talked about, but for a kind of contract for emergency ICU medicines, so anesthetics, certain antibiotics, et cetera, that you use in a hospital. And I was not involved in that procurement because it was a very secret procurement, but I was involved in a project to prevent the shortage of ICU medicine, so that's why I'm quite aware of it. I can say for the first approach for the ICU emergency medicines, this was a very complicated exercise for the industry for a couple of reasons. The main one is that there was no commitment to purchase. So there was a commitment by the companies to supply at a certain price to the member states and to the Commission, who was actually a buyer in this case. But there was no commitment from the member states to purchase from those manufacturers. And this created a lot of chaos, because what the member states did was they made so-called commitments through the joint procurement at EU level, but then they organized a different procurement at national level for the same drugs. So the companies, if you wish, ended up with supply obligations for the European joint tender, as well as for parallel national tenders by the same countries. And so they didn't know which tender in the end the member states were going to select. And so they had to keep stocks in reserve for both tenders, which then could not be sent to other countries who needed these medicines. I think this needs to be reconsidered, is what I would say, because it was unhealthy, also in terms of the wasting of stocks that could have been supplied for patients elsewhere. Now, I know in the joint procurement for vaccines a little bit different because there was actually some kind of upfront payments and various things like that. So some money was committed here. I don't know what went wrong. It's difficult to see what went wrong with some of these. I think some of it went right because we see, I mean, some supplies are being there. There are manufacturing issues out there. I think perhaps one of the lessons learned here is that there could be a consideration of how to mobilize the industry in this kind of emergency situation to unlock any barriers to the entire industry contributing. I think there is an issue, obviously, of supply. This is sometimes specialized production, but Europe has the biggest production of vaccines. So the biggest number of vaccine factories are actually located in Europe. For mRNA, which is not actually traditional vaccine manufacturing, we probably also have the biggest production capabilities in the world. So I think maybe there's a thought about how to facilitate coordination, cooperation, what have you, just knowing that there are legal limitations to this. So for the industry doing it on its own, under competition law, you cannot coordinate the industry, of course. This is something that is strictly forbidden. But the European Union and the member states, of course, could, in theory, do such a thing to facilitate the upscaling, let's say. I think this is probably what would be a solution here going forward. Will joint procurement continue to be used? I think in crisis situations, the Commission has clearly put this on the table as something that it wants to strengthen. I'm assuming it will go through. The key question will be, what is the definition of a crisis situation, I think, going forward?
Andre, did you want to come in on this joint procurement issue?
I'll really explain, how this looks, from the industry point of view. But I think it's interesting, very interesting experience for all of us, because I think we should really say this is very innovative also way of doing things. It was born after the H1N1 pandemic situation, so we have seen this all unhealthy kind of problems, how to access to medicines, through backdoor to the contracts already made by companies and some states, so also and so on. So we brought this concept. Now we are using, since number of more than a year now, because Adrian, you mentioned ICU. This was not only complex because from the industry side, but also was complex from the Commission side. How to purchase generic medicines, when often it was a problem to define, for example, the doses, the use in the ICU in country A or B, or because the market is diverse, to the national market. So it was a lot of problems to set up this kind of tender. So this is one of the lessons. Of course, many others were mentioned by Adrian already. For example, we made a contract available to member states, but of course, the final agreement, the contract should be signed by individual member states. They already decided to participate in the contract. This was like this. They came to the contract because they wanted to be there. They did. Then later was the issue of how to sign the contract and when. The second interesting experience was, of course, advanced purchasing agreement. This is quite unique, I think, in the scale and the complex. So how you invest in the future medicines or future vaccines, you don't know. Are they going to work? Which one is the best? Which one maybe first on the market? and what is the capacity of industry to build this product and deliver. So this was, I think, quite interesting experience. I think we will continue to study more. Let's hope, you know, the one day this pandemic will be over. And I will mention the third option. We also bought the antivirals during summer, remdesivir, which also we are in the monopoly situation, the one producer, and we come together. And here we have two examples. One, the first part was bought by Commission from the EU money, and the same day across Union, patients go and doctors got access to these medicines. Unbelievable story, you know, historical moment. You know, always we say, especially you as a consumer associations, it's possible to get, you know, in one country, but it's not possible today to many others. So I think this was a good example. And then we have the second part of the same product contract when member states came to the traditional kind of now joint procurement. So they declare we want this type of medicines and this number of medicines and so on. So I think we have at least 3 interesting case studies, which I hope, you know, also consumer associations, organizations will study and advise, you know, how you feel this also in this experience, and what is your lessons from those cases.
Thanks. Well, we're just about out of time, but before we wrap up the panel, I just want to put, we got one question here from Charlotte Ruffian from Francis Osante. Louisa, I'm going to put this to you. Can the proposal for the, I'm sorry, actually, Claudia, I'm going to put this to you, Claudia. Can the proposal for the revision of the orphan drug regulation set a precedent for cost transparency, including public funding? Claudia, what would be your answer to that?
Sorry, but I'm not the best person to answer, but probably, and I think the incentives for pediatric and orphan drugs can, what can I say, can have a result because they have public incentives, so they should make more affordable these drugs. But for the specific question, I don't think that I'm the right person to answer. Maybe my colleagues of the panel can.
Andre, do you have a quick response to that?
No, this is in the inception impact assessment. We say this burden, you know, proof for the industry. If you would like to prolong, you know, you be on the market, you know. So this is one of the idea, you know, how we can really see the you know, how medicines will develop and what is the investment, you know, behind, you know, this again complex issue, because often those medicines are developed in the university settings, then go to the startup company or spin-off. So how money are coming, you know, from different sources of public funding, for example, the venture capitals, they are getting money from the EU funds to share the risk. You know, this is a kind of example, but of course R&D costs are not easy to calculate. But as I think Luis already mentioned, that we try to build these guidelines, or I think the previous panel, sorry, I think so maybe. We try to kind of find a better understanding, and hopefully we can get also into agreement, because this is a really call, you know, from many parties to make more transparency, but not easy.
Dave, is the question on safety stocks?
It's on orphan drug regulation. I'm not sure if it's specifically on safety stocks.
Sorry.
I think we do have to wrap it up there because we're about out of time. These are very complex issues, as Andre just noted. And I think that all of our panelists and both panels have done a great job of really simplifying some of this stuff. And certainly there will be more conversations taking place after this, I'm sure. I'd like to turn it over now for some closing remarks by Ancela Santos, the Senior Health Policy Officer at BEUC. Ancela?
Yes. Can you stop my video?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Can you see me now? Thank you, Dave. And thanks to the participants, the speakers as well, for the interesting discussions. So if there is a word that comes to my mind is momentum. Several speakers mentioned that indeed the pharma strategy brings an opportunity to fix the gaps that we have in the system and that impact negatively the end users, so consumers, patients, and healthcare professionals as well. For example, we heard that drug shortages make people sicker. They also lead to increased costs for consumers. We also heard that pharmacists, for example, spend 6.3 hours a week on average to try to find solutions and alternative medicines. And we know that this is not a new problem, it's getting worse, although COVID has made it more visible. So what can we do about it? I think our panelists agreed in that we need European solutions. And Jay from the Commission mentioned that they are doing a study on the root causes of shortages that will be published this summer, and that there will be a revision of the legislation and some additional actions to improve medicines availability. He did mention that overall the strategy will aim at, let's say, achieving a balance between, let's say, these public health goals of medicines accessibility, availability, affordability, and also the need to keep the industry competitive and innovative. Other measures that were put forward by panelists were the need to focus more on prevention, so to prevent shortages instead of having to manage them. There were also calls for alternative production models, for stockpiling, and I think here there was a comment from the Commission saying that, okay, we need to look at it from the European perspective, so we need European solutions and a European approach to that. There were also calls for removing barriers for pharmacists so they can do their job more easily. Monique mentioned the need to include the demand side, so consumers, in the discussions that the Commission is having on these issues, in addition to talking to the industry. We talked about the need to bring some production back in Europe, and I think Andrei mentioned the words independent, resistance, so that's where we should head to. But we're also called for diversification of the supply and calls for taking into account the question of affordability and the environmental impact as well when it comes to discussions about relocation. Nicolas mentioned that the EMA regulation can also help improve shortages in crisis situations, in addition to having to fix other structural problems. We talked about the transparency also of the vaccine contracts. On affordability, so many challenges there as well for consumers and patients. Martin mentioned that some medicines are very expensive. They can cost up to hundreds of thousands of euros. This impacts patients and the healthcare system in general. We know that the entry of generics and biosimilars can help improve affordability, accessibility, but there are barriers, as Adrian mentioned. So we need to tackle misuses of IP, also have better procurement rules. There was a lot of discussion about also the need to increase transparency in medicines pricing, R&D costs, but also transparency of net prices. And we need to have more information sharing amongst member states. And the Portuguese presidency is going to have these discussions also with other member states in the context of the Council conclusions. We need to attach conditions to R&D to make sure that the public contribution is reflected in the final price. We talked about joint procurement. And indeed, as Andrei mentioned, it is helping to ensure equitable access to vaccines across Europe. So that's very good. We talked about HTA. We might finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. So let's see if there might be an agreement under the Portuguese presidency. And on competition law, I would like to also highlight what we heard from Luisa, the role of consumer groups in acting as watchdogs, monitoring the market and bringing cases of abuse of dominant position, excessive prices to the attention of antitrust authorities. And now we look forward to seeing also the outcome of the investigation of the Commission on the Aspen case. So to conclude, I mean, the next years won't be boring, that's for sure. At BEUC, we look forward to engaging in this process and also to keeping the dialogue open with all of you, also to the health policy platform that was mentioned. And before passing the word to you, Dave, I would like to invite you all to check our Twitter account. It's @BEUC. There's a video that we've done with some of our members with testimonials of people talking about the impact of high-priced medicines. So with this, I conclude and I pass the floor to you, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks, Ancela. As you mentioned, certainly a hot topic, and I imagine this is not the last discussion we're all going to have about this as we talk about the pharma strategy over the coming year. So thank you to all the panelists for some great insights, and thank you to you at home for following along. I wish you a great remainder of your day. Take care.